of the best things you could do is tell a crisis story that you had in your life, because the minute you show vulnerability, someone can relate to you. Think of yourself as the startup, right? And how are you going to pitch yourself? Because in many cases, that's how the power of persuasion works, is through the power of your personality or your stories or your knowledge, you're going to get someone to get on board with you. If you're going to recruit and retain people, you have to have your North Star. You have to have your future story, because you're asking them to go on that journey with you. And to go on faith is one thing, to go on a vision is another. I think the best thing you can do is get the hearts and minds of your employees first and get them behind the vision and that journey and that story that you're trying to tell. And then they are your face of your brand, and they're helping you evangelize because they feel it and they love it as much as you do. And then in turn, the customer is going to love it as well. A lot of people know design thinking as a way to prototype, test, iterate a product. One of my big takeaways from design thinking was, how do you change the dynamic of collaboration?
You just heard Jennifer Greenwood, who's been into marketing communications, internal communications, storytelling, and design thinking for decades. Most recently, she was a manager at Apple, where she amplified Apple's culture across its over 450 retail stores in 18 plus countries. Today, she turns ideas into stories that matter for clients everywhere, with the means of mindful communications and storytelling. It's been a pleasure talking to Jennifer at her place in Mountain View, California, and I hope you'll have a great time listening as well. With all that said, please enjoy this new episode of the Sparkr Podcast about the power of storytelling with Jennifer Greenwood. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to be at your home. Thanks very much for having me and for donating your time, your precious time, to talk to me and the Sparkr Podcast. This episode is about the power of stories. And I think when I met you here in San Francisco, I thought you were like the perfect person to have a conversation with about the power of stories. Mm-hmm. And maybe just give us a short intro to what your story is, mm-hmm. actually.
So I've been thinking about this, and if I were to think of a through line through my life, it's probably curiosity. And that's what got me to thinking about storytelling as where I want to go next with my career. So if I would go way back, I grew up in the Midwest outside of Chicago, a very typical childhood. Mm-hmm. If you saw any of the movies like 16 Candles or Ferris Bueller's Day Off or Home Alone, those movies were actually filmed in my town. And some of those kids were in the movies that I grew up with. So there's a reason why John Hughes filmed there. It was what you would imagine as a typical American childhood. What wasn't typical is my parents, from a very early age, instilled in me that you need to think about more than just yourself, and that there's an impact in the world that you can make. And one of the first experiences was they sent me to an experimental school called Martin Luther King Jr. Laboratory School. That's a mouthful. And it was named after the civil rights hero who died, unfortunately. And so from a very early age, I was exposed to different cultures, different conversations, and the thought that you should do more than just things for yourself, for lack of a better phrasing. And so combine that with, I was also very fearless and quirky child, and my favorite character when I was a kid was from a book called Curious George, and he was a little monkey. And so I thought I was a monkey, and I'd be hanging from trees and always hurting myself and just kind of being a curious little person. And that also informed my life, as I said. So curiosity led me to, I was very lucky that because my mom was a travel agent, we went to a lot of places, and I got the travel bug. And so in high school, I went to an exchange program in Spain, and that was the first time I probably understood that it wasn't, that the world didn't revolve just around America, right? That there were things going on, lives, people experiencing very different things. And this was Spain in a very interesting time after Franco died and fascism. And I was also there when there was an attempt on Reagan's life. So the first huge trauma around, attempted assassination. So travel and going by myself was something I always liked doing. And then was always involved in art and trying to go through this really quickly. I, again, grew up a very traditional Midwestern childhood, but I didn't like doing what other people did. So
like a little bit contrarian.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Contrarian. And that probably comes from my dad, where it was always the question, well, why that way? Mm-hmm. Who said it have to be that way?
Yeah.
And having the curiosity to maybe not necessarily challenge, but wonder, just to wonder. And I loved sitting in that space of just imagination and wonderment. And so I got into art at a very, very early age. Both of my parents are in medicine. And I thought I would be a veterinarian for many, many years of my life, and even would lure my pets into the bathroom and pretend I was the doctor. And but art was always in the background. And so when I went to school, I found the most contrarian school possible. Because when you grow up in the Midwest, you're supposed to go to a Big Ten school with a football team and rah-rah with the pom-poms and the cheerleaders. And instead, I found, again, an experimental school in Colorado. There were less than 2,000 students, and we took one class at a time. And it was an immersive experience, and I would take classes like Black Religion in America or Renaissance music. And my background led me to major in fine art, but the great thing about a liberal arts college is you actually can't take too many classes in your major. Mm-hmm. So I just had all these great experiences. That was really fun. So just going with the flow, being in the moment was a lot of my life. And then I thought I wanted to go to architecture school. Mm-hmm. So did a summer program at Harvard.
Yeah.
At the Graduate School of Architecture. They called themselves the Graduate School of Design. And came back, yep, I'm going to be an architect. And I interned at an architecture firm. And then just on a competitive streak, another woman who was interning applied for grad school. And so I said, I'll apply for grad school. No intention of going, but I got in.
Mm-hmm. Oops.
So oops, I guess I got to go. So I went to grad school. And pretty quickly realized maybe not. And I remember my dad telling me, it rang in my ear that he had gone to school for engineering but couldn't visualize in 3D.
Okay.
And I realized I had that deficiency as well.
That's an issue.
It's a big problem. And so I found my way into, I didn't realize it at the time, but desktop publishing and the Mac became very popular. And I found my way into our school's journal, the editorial group. And I taught myself the page layout and started interviewing architects, and we did stories. And next thing I knew, I was really into this thing called computer graphics. And Long story short, quit architecture school, went to the Czech Republic to teach English, and then came back.
What brought you to the Czech Republic?
Oh, okay. So
Just
so there's the story.
All right.
So when I was in grad school, we were studying urban planning and architecture and the history. And there was a building they showed on the Vltava River. They call it the Moldau in Germany and the United States, but it's the Vltava River. And it was this gorgeous building. And at the time, I was obsessed with the Bauhaus and the international style. And this building just stuck with me. And we didn't have Google and everything back then, but I came to find out it was this amazing building, and it just stuck in my head. So that when I came home after realizing grad school just wasn't for me, so a failed grad student, what am I going to do next? And I read a story about how this husband and wife created basically an NGO, a nonprofit, to teach the Czech people English. Because they needed to reintegrate themselves into the Western world, and in order to have their businesses be in the Western world, they had to learn English.
What time was that? So approximately
1991.
All right.
It was just after the Velvet Revolution, so communism had just ended, and they were thrust into capitalism with very little resources, knowledge. And so I read this article, I apply, I get in, I fly there, and the funny thing is I get off the train and I couldn't find anything because the Czechs had quickly changed all the names of the streets.
Okay. Oh, wow.
They hated that the streets were all these communist names. So Rudy Armati was Red Army, that had changed. So I'm crying as I'm walking through the streets at 6 a.m. in the morning, not knowing where to go. And somehow I find the place that is my so-called agency that's going to place me. They had no idea who I was. The paperwork never got to them.
Wow.
They didn't know what to do with me, but they said, hey, let's just go have breakfast and we'll figure it out. Well, it's a good thing they lost my paperwork, because had they known I was coming, I would have been placed in a very sad, rundown industrial town very far away from Prague. Instead, they kept me in Prague and found me a job in a place that was called the Canadian Club, which was a bar that had popped up as an English school. And it was called the Canadian Club. Here's a story for you. World War II, there were paramilitary paratroopers from Canada with the Allied forces that had come into Prague to try and help save them. And so they had this fond memory of the Canadians, and so they named a bar after them. So we taught English out of the bar.
That's a good place to learn English.
Yes. And then it got to be so popular, we ended up going to different places to teach people. So I was teaching a brewery and their brewmasters English, because the Bavarian beer laws required that you fill out paperwork, and they already knew German, but I guess English was important. I taught art historians, I taught doctors, engineers, and I asked them, well, you all seem to know English, why? Because they had learned the King's English, British English, Oxford English, but they said they wanted to learn American English. They wanted to learn the conversational English. So.
And why is that? Why did they not want to stick with the Oxford English and rather go for the American
Because
way?
I think this was a while ago, but if I can remember, they understood that the art of conversation was very important with negotiations or how to navigate the new world. I think part of it was fascination, because radio free Europe, different radio stations or records they were smuggling in. They loved country music.
Wow.
Random, but just loved country music. So Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, anything they could get their hands on, which quickly became my curriculum, where I taught them lyrics, and that's how they were learning English.
Burning Ring of Fire. And
exactly. Patsy Cline was my go-to. To teach them colloquialisms, so the phrases that Americans use, they just loved. For example, one that I think of is to say no problem, right? Because if you think about that phrase, that's implying there aren't problems. And most of their life,
there have been many problems.
So that it was like this freeing kind of aspirational language that they wanted to be a part. I'm making it, I think, make it sound more magical than it was, but
that's
anyway.
The power of stories.
Exactly, right?
Here we go.
And so those songs had great stories, right? So what I would say, if I could sum up why maybe country music and this myth of America was so exciting is I've been thinking about how we're different here and why we embrace failure so much. And there's some kind of myth or mystique to the rise, fall, and then rise again.
The phoenix.
Yes. And Americans love that when someone fails and comes back. And I don't know if it's because of this rugged individualism like Daniel Boone or the pioneers, but somehow that's hardwired into you as an American that failure is something exciting and that around the corner something will be even more wonderful. So maybe that's why they love the songs, because many country songs are sad if you take them apart, right? Especially Ring of Fire. Johnny Cash's first marriage, was horrible, and then, he had the love of his life through an affair, but and what he had to do to get there. But in the end, he was happier, right? So that was my long way of saying I went to the Czech Republic and then I came back. And so when I came back, it was a funny time because I had such an amazing experience in the Czech Republic and had left feeling like such a failure from graduate school. But I came back to when the Chicago Bulls won their first championship. And Chicago came alive. Such celebration because, yes, we had a football team that had won once, but Chicago wasn't known for its winning teams. And Chicago had several decades of really bad things happen. Riots, factories closing, violence. And so it was coming back to just this new chapter, and it was very exciting. So it was a great way to kind of get back into being there. And so what I decided to do was interview a lot of people and ask them how they had their jobs and what recommendations they had for me. And it pretty soon became clear that I wanted to pursue graphic design, and I went back to school. So I had an undergrad, half of a grad program, and decided to do another undergrad in graphic design. And a couple semesters in, started a job at the school itself, and then was asked by my boss at the time to become a full-time employee, and then so left college and started my graphic design career. I think I should probably stop there because that's a very long story.
It's amazing what you all, what stories you have just from your life. That's amazing. And if you would have to generalize, what would you say is, let's say, one of the greatest or maybe the greatest story ever told?
So I was talking to my husband about this, and I was thinking, well, I guess you could say the Bible or Shakespeare. But if the first thing, I like to think, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And for me, instantly what came to mind was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I thought to myself, well, why? And it's probably because I was steeped in Martin Luther King as a child, having gone to a school named after him, but also it's the story of promise of the future. Because when he talks about I have a dream, it's the story of his children and what the possibility for them could be. And that to me, the optimism there, even though what he was speaking about seemed so far off and impossible for so many people, and they had come out from such horrible violence within a few years of what he was talking about. Riots and horrible police brutality, and he had even been imprisoned. But just that story of what it would be for his children, the dream he had about that. And so for me, the best stories are ones that also have a future story.
Yeah. And there's one thing that comes to my mind. My next question is going to be, how do you craft a great story, or what makes a great story great? What are the building blocks?
Yes.
And maybe I want to give it a little nudge towards a certain direction.
Okay.
There's this author, Simon Sinek,
Yes.
with his famous book, Start
Yes.
With Why.
Yes.
And in his TED Talk, he actually referenced Martin Luther King's speech. And he said, well, it was, I have a dream speech,
Yes.
and not, I have a plan speech.
I didn't remember that part.
And maybe that's something you can get into. Why do you think has he made this distinction that it's important that it was a dream and not a plan?
Right. I love that. Well, a funny thing is the Silicon Valley is such a funny place that I actually met Simon. It's a favorite little diner near here. And I had just come from traveling the world for business, and we used his video as an intro for our roundtable discussions. And my husband and I were going to breakfast to catch up, and I am not kidding, there's Simon sitting one booth away from us.
Perfect.
And I'm the type of person where I have this dilemma. Do I want to bother someone? But I feel like I have to say something. So I went up to him and said something. And he said, oh my gosh. And, you know, I love Apple too. And,
it's one
so
of his
I have a
favorite
photo
of his favorite examples.
Yes. So I had the person he was eating breakfast with take a picture of him and I. So because I was, you know, to meet a hero like that, I had to interrupt him, and he didn't seem to mind. But yes, so I love that. So if I can back out and say, I have been working with people to help craft stories for quite a while now. And I had my own structure in my head, and it was mostly based on gut and emotion. But about 3 years ago, I decided to start taking classes to say, how are other people doing it? What is their framework? What are they talking about? So one of the first classes I took was one called Visual Story, Nancy Duarte. And she's quite famous in the Valley. She's helped people like Steve Jobs in the past with their presentations. And her class, they diagram Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream.
There's a TED Talk
speech.
that shows that as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and the whole structure she has is what they call what is, what could be, what is, what could be, what is, what could be, new bliss.
Yeah.
So that would be something I recommend to everyone is get her book, Resonate. And then she has a new book, came out maybe about a year and a half ago called Illuminate, where they do case studies on famous leaders and what they've done around storytelling is the broad term. Or I would argue it's the power of persuasion at the end of the day. You could call it presentation skills, you could call it pitch decks, whatever. But for me, it's the power of persuasion. And then Ed Catmull came out with a book, Creativity Inc. If you haven't read it,
it's perfect. It's a very good book.
And you can find him on YouTube. He's been interviewed. Actually, down the street, Computer History Museum has a great series that he was at. And then Robert McKee, who's a famous Hollywood screenwriter. I took his class recently called Storynomics. And so I've been collecting all these frameworks. And then about a year ago, I befriended a animation director from Pixar, and we've been talking about this. So this is my formula. And, hire me if you want. But basically, this is what I walk people through is there's your founding story. And many people leave, or your origin story, many people leave that on the table, so to speak. So if you go to a website and under the About page, it's only your products or only your feeds and speeds, as we say in the Valley. But it's nothing about you and why you started. Shame on you. Why aren't you sharing that? Especially where we sit. We are just down the street from where NASA was founded.
Yeah.
We are just down the street from Google. WhatsApp, the inventor, is from Mountain View. Steve Jobs, first childhood home, right here, right? So the origin stories are the garages, right?
Yeah.
Hewlett Packard, Apple garage are within 2 miles of here. I don't know how many kilometers, but you can do the math.
Yeah,
so, but founding stories are so much a part of what makes you great, right? So there's your founding story. And then there are signature stories, right? So it could be, in the case of Apple, the Macintosh, right? 1984. Or with YouTube. You name the company, right? They're significant milestones. But for me, where it's interesting is the crisis stories. And Ed Catmull talks about this, that especially if your company has been around for a while, as new people join your company and they weren't part of the founding, they don't feel a part of that. They're definitely drawn to your company because it's an interesting story, but the shared experience, they weren't there for the founding, and they probably weren't there for the significant story. But if you all are there when something goes wrong and you had to learn from it, and we like to say there's like a bunker mentality, you know, in the military where you're there together and you get through it, then you now have a shared experience to go from.
Yeah.
And, you know, failure is something that many people celebrate here. So what did you learn from that failure? For me, if you're going to, especially now where many people are speaking about millennials and the younger generation, if you're going to recruit and retain people, you have to have your North Star. You have to have your future story, because you're asking them to go on that journey with you. And to go on faith is one thing. To go on a vision is another, right? Because you want to feel part of something bigger than yourself.
There's so many questions that come up because I love what you're saying. First is, let's go backwards. First is, how do you distinguish faith and vision?
Right.
How do you take that apart? And then another thing, I just want to get it out there so I hopefully don't forget it. I think it's interesting that your approach has been to learn by doing, do it yourself, get your first experiences, many experiences over the years. And only after quite some time of doing it yourself, you decided to expose yourself to theories, to best practices, so to speak. And I would also like you to maybe talk a little bit about that. If you think that this is a very good approach in general, or maybe if it's just been the right approach for you. And just, I think it's interesting because nowadays, oftentimes it's the opposite. Everybody exposes themselves to theory and then they believe, okay, that's how it's done. And they kind of miss out on interesting other ways they could walk on. So that's also something that stuck with me.
Okay, so I would say the difference between faith and vision is a really thoughtful question. So I think it's a combination of both, because the leaders that are expressing that vision, they have to have faith.
Yeah.
And I was having an interesting conversation with one of my old directors, who's on a different team now.
At Apple?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And we were just talking. And we were talking about leadership. And I said that I have been thinking a lot about leadership, and that what do people want in leaders? And a friend of mine the other day added a fourth, which I love, because I like threes, but I'm going to give her the fourth because she was brilliant.
All right.
So I'd say one is vision and purpose. As a leader, you have to have the vision and purpose and express it to your team. You also have to have a passion. It's one thing to have a vision and purpose, but if they don't feel your passion, if they feel you're inauthentic, or they feel you're just going through the motions, that's when there's a disconnect. And then the third is air cover. If I'm going to take a risk for you, if things don't work out, are you going to be there for me?
Yeah.
Or are you going to say, ooh, you screwed up, I screwed up, that's okay. Let's figure out how we can learn from it and do it differently next time. Or do it the same, but maybe tweak it. But the fourth, my friend, she's so smart, said curiosity. You have to have curiosity as a leader. Because if you're constantly wondering, the minute you think everything's all good is the minute you should start to worry. Right? So that was a bit of a tangential piece. So vision versus faith was your original question. So definitely have to have faith, but vision is maybe not for you. It's for the people around you, whether it's your customer or your employee. They have to see your vision. It's not enough to go on faith. Maybe they'll have the faith to go with you, but your faith isn't their faith. And maybe I'm parsing here. Vision is, this is where we are now, and this is where I see us going. And we're going to go on this journey together. And maybe I don't know all the steps, but I know here, and I know I want to go there.
Vision is more like a path.
Yeah.
While faith is just a setting of beliefs or a collection of beliefs.
Yeah, so I don't think you should necessarily decouple them. I think it's an interesting discussion to talk about the differences. Maybe I would argue you need both. Especially in hard times. And there were many times when we were trying, as we say, on the tightrope, right? Where you're trying very risky things and you have to have the faith that it'll be okay. Or if it's not, that your culture has the strength to endure it. And we had some of those where we were trying new things, going to new places. And because of our culture, we were able to band together and do it because we had the faith, I guess, and because of the vision that we would get there, or we would at least try. How about that? Trying. Now, your other question, can you remind me of it?
Yeah. Before I will remind you of it, again, you provoked other questions. What I thought interesting is when you talked about leadership, I guess, I believe that everything you said about leadership demonstrated that stories are ultimately about forming a tribe.
Yes.
And as soon as you have formed a tribe, you've reached a point where you have a culture that helps the tribe endure the hard times, taking risks. Yeah. So, would you say, are you in it with me on that conclusion that it's all about forming a tribe?
Tribes can change because tribal can be a very loaded word too, both negative and positive, right? You're part of my tribe. Oh, they're being very tribal, right? So that you're part of my tribe is kind of fun because it's inclusive. You're being tribal can connote battle or clashing. So I would say what I love is a phrase, tribal knowledge, sharing knowledge that we could both benefit from.
Yeah.
So I like that. And back to the idea of tribe, what we both were at an event the other day, Designers and Geeks.
Yes.
And she was from IDEO. She spoke about innovation is group and invention is like a solo activity. So if you think about the tribe that you create and the innovation through collaboration that could happen, I love that idea that when there's a tribe and there's a belief, a shared belief and maybe some faith,
Yeah,
because
sure.
maybe you don't have the funding yet or the product isn't made yet, but at least you have the faith that there's something worth working toward, then you are going to go through it together. I think that answers your question.
Yeah. And now the other one that I've posed before was your approach to learning, like your story.
Oh, right. So I've been doing
skills.
it for many years, and then why did I go back?
Why practical first and then going to the theory and not the other way around?
Yeah.
And is it like a general recommendation to go that
Yes.
way, or how do you think about it?
Yes and no. So how about yes and yes instead of yes and no? Because no it's not no. Yes and yes. So I would say you definitely want to study the masters. And it's great when you're young to be learning from others and hearing their experiences. And maybe, for example, you want to be a doctor one day. And you're 16 years old. So like me, when I was that age, I volunteered at my veterinarians and saw what it was to be a veterinarian. And then learned what it took to become a veterinarian. Very eye-opening. But if you learn from the masters, first of all, you have a lot of experiences to learn from and different approaches. And there's a lot of, what's the word? Sorry, I'm blanking on a word. There's, you don't have a point of view yet, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so great to, in the case of what I did for many years is I traveled, I studied the masters, I took a lot of classes. And then I just threw myself in and gave it a go. And why I am now on the other side of my career and learning again is I started to feel like I needed to be knocked off my center a little bit. That I wanted to get to that uncomfortable space of learning again.
Yeah.
I had built a team and got so many great experiences traveling the world, meeting great people, great customers. But I got curious about what were other ways people were approaching storytelling. And so I started, the TED Talk you mentioned with Simon Sinek and Nancy Duarte. And I wanted hands-on experience, not just the digital. I had been living digital life for so long. I wanted the counterpoint, the analog. And I'm very hands-on, very tactile. And there's something that happens human to human where the the back and forth. For example, email. Email is not a dialogue. Email is a series of monologues.
Yeah.
And they can get quite passive aggressive if you're not careful because there isn't tone.
Yeah. You miss out on many dimensions that make up communication.
Yeah, and people don't understand sarcasm in your email, and that can get very dangerous. So what I love about the analog is what we're doing now, right? You're giving me insights by asking me questions, right? So I was craving that. So I would advocate always being curious. There's a phrase that they use at the Stanford D School where I went for design thinking, the beginner's mind. And I'd like to think I always try to have the beginner's mind when I'm taking a new class or something like that.
Can you tell a little bit more about what it is, the beginner's mind, for the listeners?
So the beginner's mind, and I'll ask you to research this afterward.
Absolutely.
It's I believe, and you can edit this out, but the beginner's mind, my understanding is out of Zen Buddhism, and it's always coming to a situation with an open mind, no pretense, maybe not a solution, that there's a problem and you're gonna think about it with new fresh ideas, maybe not borrowing from history, and maybe not having assumptions, and really being open to it could go one way, it could go another way. And I think it's also there's an open mindset as opposed to a closed mindset, or as I heard someone say recently, a growth mindset.
Yeah.
Where you're going to grow and learn instead of be very tactical and only solutions and execution based.
Yeah.
And what I used to like to say when someone came to me with something that I was concerned we wouldn't be able to do, or maybe I thought wasn't something we should do, I'd say, I'm not saying no, I'm saying yes to a better solution.
Oh, that's nice.
And while that might sound cheeky, what I was trying to do is get to the deeper why. Why is it that we wanted to do this? And were we considering not only the business need, but the end user and what they needed to hear?
To me, it somehow sounds like with the beginner's mind, you don't look at a problem and kickstart the search for a solution, but you take your time to actually reflect if the problem that you're looking at is actually the right problem to look at. So you take more time to consider if you're actually looking at the right problem before rushing your way to maybe a not so reasonable direction.
And I think that's why so many people like these true crime shows where at first you think the murder was committed by one person, but the more they investigate, it takes a different turn, right? So if you take that beginner's mind stance, you're not going to... Here's a great example a friend of mine shared with me once is if you sit in that mindset, you're going to approach a problem like a therapist instead of a surgeon. A surgeon's going to go in and cut out the cancer, sew you up, send you on your way. Whereas a therapist is going to say, tell me more. Let's talk about this. Have you thought about this? And then you go away and you think, and then you come back and you and the therapist are having more discussions. And it may take a little longer to quote unquote cure you or for you to feel like you're steady and can feel more confident again.
But chances are you reach the real source of the issue and not just the symptoms.
And maybe you didn't even know what the problem was, but it was through the talking that you say, wow, I didn't realize it was because I was still holding on to, something that happened in my childhood or something like that. My dad's a psychiatrist, so of course I'm going to use a therapy example there, but sitting in the problem and being okay with it might be uncomfortable, it might be awkward, you might actually have some difficult conversations, but in the end, there's a solution that is better for the product, for the customer, and for the person that's hearing it. Whether that's the employer or the customer. The other thing I would say is the piece around empathy, and that's something we use a lot in the Valley. User-centered design, or use empathy to understand. And I've been thinking a lot about the word empathy. And if I think empathy, I say, oh, poor Christian, I feel bad that he got lost. I would argue, is it compassion that you need? Because compassion, if you heard Ko when we were talking to her after the lecture the other day, she said how she has an employee who tries to fall in love.
Yes, that was beautiful.
With the customer or the client.
Yeah.
I love that so much. And I think that's why I think about compassion instead of empathy.
Yeah.
Because compassion means you're moved to action and you want to do something to help that person.
Yes, I love that distinction, because empathy is just, I feel you.
Yes.
I know what's happening with you.
Yes.
But compassion has more activating energy
Yes.
to it. Yes, I love that.
Yeah, and I think that's why I've gone from storytelling is so powerful when you are an NGO or you are fundraising, because you're telling a story and people want to give you money. And for the longest time, I would donate and that would make me feel better. And in the last year or so, things have changed a lot. And I realized that wasn't enough for me. So I started volunteering more. And I wanted to be with the people who needed my help and not just do that guilty citizen, here's
my cash.
So I went from empathy to compassion in my own life. Practice what you preach, I guess is what you could say, but I needed that. And I would argue I get more than I give when I do that as well. So that's something else that got me to the storytelling, is I realized it's not only something I love to do, it's something I loved helping others to do. And while I was fine with kind of just having this gut check for how to tell a good story, I was engaging with a lot of people that are very binary and really needed to understand the framework I was taking them through. For example, I had someone, he's since left, and he had come from a more conservative company. And then when he came to us, I was working with him on a presentation, and he had a lovely North Carolina accent. And he's like, Jan, if I had a conference and I was speaking like this and there were no words on the slide, no one would come. They'd wonder why they flew here. They need some, meat.
Facts.
Some facts, lots of words on the slide. And I said, but you're there. You're the expert. You're the one that's going to deliver that. And let's tell them a story. And then he and I got into a really great story conversation about, he came from a sales background, and he said the best salesmen are storytellers. And I said, exactly. And this is why you're going to do it this way. And we're going to strip all those words off the slides. And we're just going to have the absolute minimum amount of words that are necessary to have what people need, but also not compete with you and your message. It's like this perfect tension. So that's when I started to think about, okay, it's hard for me to articulate what it is I want them to go through. So I probably need to have a more formalized framework to be able to have them go on the faith of going with me on the journey that we're going to make a good presentation together. Like,
you need a framework so that you can actually have your multiplying effect of influencing others.
They need it. I don't.
True. Yeah, they need it.
I don't need it. They need it. And then also, I'm a more circuitous, tangential thinker. Others aren't. And I can wander and come back. Maybe others can't. And maybe that's not fair for me. So to have a framework that they can feel comfortable in. So back to the compassion thing, like have the compassion for the person that you're working with. So, and then also just the beginner's mind always being the learner, not the teacher, I think it is very humbling. So in a past life, I taught Photoshop. And I would ask people at the beginning of the class to rate, are you a beginner, are you an expert? I'd like to know. And I was always very cautious with the ones who called themselves experts. Because I thought, okay, are they going to be present? Are they going to want to learn? And are they going to be disruptive to the beginners who are going to feel intimidated? Or are they going to be helpful? So what I did was, first of all, it was a gut check to notice who might be a challenge, but also I would pair them with the people who underrated themselves. So the people that called them experts overrated themselves. And then there were people who were very hard on themselves, and so they were underrating themselves. So I'd try and put them together and rearrange the classroom so that there could be the beginner and the teacher, because maybe the teacher could be humbled a little and slow down. You know, I was the big teacher, but in that relationship, I thought that was good to pair the so-called expert with the so-called beginner, and then they could learn from each other.
It's great that you take the conversation to that point, because I wanted to ask a question in this direction. So the importance of the beginner's mind, you've outlined it very well. And but I thought all the time, everybody has assumptions. Everybody comes into a meeting or into a whatever and already has kind of an idea where he wants to take it or where she wants to go with it. So, and now you brought it up. There's always those people who say they are the experts and those who underrate themselves. Over all those times that you've did this, have you found like a recipe or a process how you can lead or take the experts to the beginner's mind, letting go of assumptions, letting go of their like need to feel like superior, or how do you take this?
Yeah, so this is where design thinking comes in handy. So a lot of people know design thinking as a way to prototype, test, iterate a product. One of my big takeaways from design thinking was, how do you change the dynamic of collaboration?
Yeah.
And there's two elements that they taught us in the Stanford D School Executive Boot Camp, which I recommend for people to take. There's a free promotion for them. One is the concept of posture, and the other is the concept of environment. So both my husband and I have led and lead design thinking workshops within our workplaces. And I'll give you two examples. One was where it didn't work, and one was where it worked. So one thing you want to be mindful of is when you get very excited around design thinking or some new concept, but you're coming back into your company and they haven't experienced that, they're still who they are. You might be changed and super excited. And if you try and impose that new framework on them, they're going to say, can we just get back to work? Or just kind of shut you out. And so I experienced that with someone who came back super excited, and they had the sticky notes and the Sharpies and the boards, and we're going to do this. And it almost felt like in America, like what we call summer camp, right? Where, yay! You have to understand what those people need out of it too. So what I learned was, that's all great and it's very exciting. We're going to collaborate with sticky notes and Sharpies and come up with fun ideas. What I did was, when I had a workshop, I would make sure to get to the room very early. I would have nice music playing. I'd maybe turn down the lights a little bit. I'd have a welcome slide or, just say welcome. I made sure they had everything they needed. So the water, the notebook, their table, we call it table tent, their name sign.
Yeah.
So that the minute they walk in, it's frictionless. They can already tell it's going to be fun, because meetings, not always fun, right?
Yeah.
You're too busy. There's another thing to do. Instead, make this something for them to look forward to. So that's the environment. And then the posture is humility, being humble, understanding they might not want to be there, but maybe you can help them make it the least stressful event of the day, and hopefully maybe even a little interesting, thought-provoking, and fun. So one thing I learned with posture was, especially with maybe folks who are executives or very busy, is start by asking what they know, what they hope for, before you start at all.
Get it out of the way so they can let it all out,
Yes.
be the expert for a couple
Yes.
of minutes, and then...
Well, also, how about they probably have something really important to say, and if all you're doing is presenting to them, but you didn't ever ask them what they wanted or what they needed or what they thought, and they're probably the person that gave you the request to begin with, maybe you're also checking, oh gosh, am I a little off? And you have a little time to kind of rejigger what you were going to present to them too.
Start by getting everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
By letting them speak.
And showing some humility. The other thing when you talk about posture and environment is, if you have everyone standing and there isn't someone in front of the room, I am the expert, and then you're all sitting, except the extreme extrovert, that person standing at the front of the room is nervous and feeling like everyone's judging them, and all the people at the sitting around are hoping, gosh, I hope this is worth my time. So there's already this kind of icky tension. So if everyone's standing and there's music and maybe even have a little bit of food, for me it's always about the food. Have a little food, because the social element at the beginning, and in many other cultures around the world, breaking bread, as they say, is very important before you start the negotiations. So one of my favorites that was done successfully is, I had realized from other workshops we had done, there was kind of a cold start, or as they say in theater, a cold open.
Yeah.
And what I realized was, I had a workshop, and the night before I took everyone to dinner. They didn't know each other. And so over a nice meal, they all got to know each other. There were some commonalities, and the tribe was formed, so that the next morning they were all kind of rooting for each other to succeed. They had already met me, so there wasn't this awkward tension of, gosh, I hope this is gonna be worth my time. And then the person that we were doing the project for, she came in and just shared her thoughts in a more informal way. And so I would argue that you should probably learn those things as much as the design thinking process of empathy, create, prototype, ideate. All of those are very important elements, but think about designing the experience as well.
Yeah, that's very important. Something that I would like to jump to now, we're already getting into it, is the storytelling on a corporate level.
Yeah.
And it's hard enough to find your own story for your own life. How do you manage to get a large group of people, let's say in a company or an NGO, to create a unifying story? How does a group find its story?
That's a good question. So if I could back out of it a little bit.
Sure.
You just reminded me of something. So a friend of ours asked us to help another friend who was developing a pitch deck for, she was going to ask venture capitalists to fund. So she had learned that she needed a pitch deck, and she already had her team assembled. And she took us through it, and she was told, this is the way to do the pitch deck. And at the end, I said to her, who are you? Why do I want to give you money? There was nothing in the deck about you and your passion and why you even thought of this to begin with. Because at the end of the day, there's a contract we're going to enter. And as an investor, I may mentor you, I may give you more money, but we're going to be hanging out for a while. So I want to know why you. Because the world is full of people who have that next great idea. So I asked her to think back and where she could add herself. And she said, well, that wasn't in the deck. That's not how I was told to do it. And I said, I'd like to have you think about that, because if you were pitching to me, I'm not feeling that emotional connection. And I think you start with the emotion. So the head and the heart.
Yeah.
So that's the individual. So I would say as a group, maybe you go through the exercise, and this is me off the cuff, of giving everyone a little homework ahead of time and asking them what they're most excited about with this venture you're going on, why they started, and where they'd like to go, right? So those past, current, and future kind of stories I was telling you earlier. And so everyone can share those stories, and you do an exercise of capturing them and seeing where their commonalities are.
Graphically, with like saying, this is where we're going, this is like you described
before. Oh, you
before,
could chart it. I would say at first, so another thing you do in design thinking is what's called flare and focus. So you just get all the stories out. And you maybe do them on sticky notes, or everyone has their own little moment to write. And then you start to cluster them by theme.
Okay.
And then what is the story you want to tell? It doesn't have to be linear, beginning, middle, and end. It could be end, beginning, then middle, right? So you figure out whatever that narrative is that the audience needs to hear. So I would say first start with your stories and then understand what it is the audience needs. So do your research on that audience. And don't think you have to do so much preamble either, because they're very busy people too. So what do they already know? And where can you add the emotional elements as well?
I like that you bring in the emotions, because you already mentioned Chloe from IDEO that we met at this event.
Yes.
And she said, and I love that line, data lets you know, stories let you feel.
Exactly.
And
she said it so perfectly.
So perfectly, yeah. So that's where we're going. And what I also found interesting is that for a company to create a story, you said it's not only an internal thing, but you also have to focus on what does the audience actually want to hear. So it's balancing both. What kind of story do employees want to stand behind, but also what story kind of has a chance of success?
Well, and this is a conversation I've been having with people lately. If I were to say there's something I have experience doing, I wouldn't want to say I'm an expert. I'd never want to put myself there. I'm still learning, especially, do you know this is the first time in the history of the world that 5 generations are all working?
Yeah, I've read about that.
So these are 5 people who all are motivated in different ways. So what you may need to hear versus what I may need to hear are different. But at the end of the day, emotions are where you can unite people. So I wouldn't be such a slave to demographics and here's our persona. If you think about some of the campaigns that go viral, it was for just one demographic that it went viral, right? And what's funny is how it works on social media, where maybe my nephew will pass something around and like a month later my grandma, would get it. Because I have a 102-year-old grandmother, right?
Wow.
5 generations, right? And so, and that's great too, because that means that story still has the power, that it wasn't just this moment in time or a meme, as we like to say, right? So if you take that apart, it probably has a really great beginning, middle, and end, or beginning, middle, future, because it's not ending. And so you can unite everyone around that. And then the idea around the best stories are story with data. So if you have a story with a few data points, that's how you remember the data points, right? And there is science behind stories, and that you remember things 22% more than you would without a story. So the science, the data point about story is you should tell story, right?
Yeah.
But back to your original question, which was?
It's actually, I think we can also jump to another point. We just talked about that we shouldn't pay too much attention on splitting stories to different demographics, and that we were talking about the unifying forces of stories. And what I would like to ask you is, you've worked for a global company with a huge range of or a huge reach regarding different countries, cultures, demographics. How do you do storytelling on such a scale, on a global scale?
Yeah, I've been fortunate that I've worked for numerous Fortune 500s and also for nonprofits. And I also have a past in children's books on the design side. And so what I would say is 2 things. One is, are you authentic? And 2, is there a truth? It's one thing to come up with amazing marketing copy. about a product. When you're talking about a person, bullet points, feeds and speeds, you're talking about a human, right? And where people connect with you is around that authenticity and the journey you've taken. And maybe a journey they're going to go on with you, or they hope to, right? Even if it's a journey of that product, but they're buying the promise, right? And so how you can cut across cultures is what is your culture and how can you transfer it in a respectful way, but one that's still true to you. So, for example, in the US, we have the Peace Corps. And I'd like to think, well, commerce is not the Peace Corps. You are someone that has deep functional expertise and you're going to another country to help that country. But you're not going to that country to turn it into America.
Yeah.
You're going there to help them in a humble way with your expertise to make their lives better for them. So I like to think of when you're telling stories to other cultures, you don't want to change what's true to you and morph it to that culture, but you want to be respectful of that culture. So there's certain things you can be mindful of. For example, sports metaphors. So in the US, if you say, hit it out of the park, that's a baseball metaphor. And outside of Latin America, Japan, and the US, and a little bit of Canada, does someone in Germany or Switzerland care about baseball? Or are you going to start to chip away at that connection you have with them? Because already they're thinking, what does that mean? So you've already removed them from that moment.
From the main storyline.
And maybe even being caught up in this great story. They're like, wait a minute, what is that? And so they've been taken out of that magical moment. So be mindful of, are you sharing stories in a way that you are compassionate to your audience and what they need, but still being true to yourself. So if you were to take the other question you asked, I think the best thing you can do is get the hearts and minds of your employees first and get them behind the vision and that journey and that story that you're trying to tell. And then they are your face of your brand and they're helping you evangelize because they feel it and they love it as much as you do. And then in turn, the customer is going to love it as well. So companies that aren't mindful of their employees being an audience are missing a key component in connection to that customer.
That leads to a mix of two questions that I wanted to ask you. And it's, on the one hand, it's this, how do you get the balance right between, you need some kind of standardization or some a unifying force when you're telling a story. That's basically the idea, to unite people. So there are some standardization motivations behind telling a story. And on the other hand, it has to be personal so that everybody can stand behind it, maybe for different reasons. That's one question. How do you balance the the standards and the personal?
Sure.
And then we can go to a follow-up question, which will be, how do you communicate internally and then externally?
Right.
Because those are very two different things. So how do you balance it first?
So first I would say, back to Simon, start with a why. If you say the what and the how, or the how and the what, but you don't say the why, especially younger generations that are working or younger customers that are maybe thinking about purchasing, why you? And you didn't tell them. It's a very competitive landscape out there.
Yeah.
And many people make purchases based on impulse or intuition. So if you're leaving that emotional component on the table, then that's probably why they're not connecting with you. The other thing that's really interesting with social media, it used to be, and I'm simplifying this, it used to be your billboard, your magazine, your ad was pushing out to the customer.
Yeah.
Now with social media and websites, the customer wants to have a dialogue with you. So are you mindful that it's going out, but also maybe coming back, right? So how do you navigate that? And I would say authentic stories. You can't ever, my husband and I talk about this, you can't ever dispute how someone feels. Now, you might not agree with how they feel, but you have to acknowledge they're feeling something. Now, you may have to have a conversation, I'm sorry you felt that way. That's not what I intended. But they are feeling something, and they have every right to feel that. Now, back to the other question of employees and customers, I'd say it's exactly the same.
Okay.
I would say don't make the distinction, because that's where you get that word just, and I hate the word just. Well, it's just the employee.
That's not good.
We only need to do, any kind of hedging language or discounting language that somehow they deserve less than the customer. They worked for you because they liked your product, I would hope. Maybe they just did it for a job and learned to really understand and like your vision, but they were probably your fanboys and fangirls, as we say. So you should be engaging with them exactly how you engage with a customer. And you're probably learning from them what works and what doesn't work before you put it out there. Hopefully you're having town halls with your employees. Hopefully you're having roundtable discussions, something where you're getting that feedback.
And would you say that has to be on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or just what do you think feels right as a feedback loop?
It's funny you say that, because I've gone around and around about this, and what I'd say is find out what they need. Because in the case of there's a corporate headquarters and then there's offices around the world, or maybe there's a corporate headquarters and then stores around the world. As a leader, you might think they need to hear from you a lot. They may have their own really robust culture, and their so-called leader is their direct manager. And what you don't want to do is leapfrog over that and disrespect that, and somehow that manager in that particular location is no longer seen as the leader. However, they want to hear the vision from you and your company. And if you don't, what is the radio silence, and why aren't you speaking to them? Are they not valuable enough? So I'd say find out what that culture is you're trying to reach, and what they need to hear from you, and how often they need to hear. Because in some cases, they might think it's too much. And in other cases, they might think it's not enough. And at what point do they need to hear from you? Do they need to hear from you when there's a big change? Chances are they do. And in different countries, there's contracts and things like that, whether you need to share or not share, and how you need to share. So definitely be mindful of cultures, laws, but also cultural traditions. So as I said earlier, in America, we kind of have this Daniel Boone, rugged individualist, I don't need a lot to get started. And in others, they need time to process. They maybe want to ask questions before they have to be pushed to that change. So I would say be mindful of that. So to wrap up, I'd say your customer and your employer are the same.
I guess still you need some time difference. I guess you don't want to announce a product at this to the customers at the same time as you do to
sometimes you have to, especially in the valley. Sometimes you have to, especially in the valley, when it's very competitive here and things are very secretive. So sometimes the employee hears at the same time as the customer.
Oh, okay.
And that's where you have the promise and the faith, right? That it's going to be okay. And that employee is as excited as that customer. So I could name countless ways that's happened in the valley where the employee is just finding out at the same time as the customer. But in the ideal situation, maybe if there's change management or something that's going to be different, ideally you'd want the employee to learn, have some time to think about it, ask questions, and then get ready for the customer, that would be a great solution as well. So I guess it depends, because sometimes if the customer finds out ahead of time and you're not ready, it's not great. But at the same time, if it leaks, the magic isn't there.
Yeah, everybody's on the same page.
Then everyone knows.
Yeah.
And then your story wasn't told in the way you wanted it to be told, because someone else told it for you.
Yeah.
Because it leaked. A factory shared a photo, or someone hacked your servers, like in Hollywood or whatever.
Yeah, we all know those leak stories, especially with iPhones or whatever. And
everyone's being hacked now.
Yeah.
The government, everyone. So I would say that maybe that's even more reason to think about knowing the story you want to tell. Because wouldn't it be great if it leaked and it's exactly how you want that story to be told, and then you get all that free press, right? So I'm not one to say leak. God knows I'm not saying that, but maybe you get some positive press out of a memo that an employee shares about a company. So.
It's I think it was Obama who once said that every email or whatever you write you should always be fine with this message appearing on the front page of the New York Times.
That's a perfect way to say that.
I think that sums up the issue very well, because you have to assume that at some point something is going to leak, and at that point your employees better be happy or excited about what they are doing. Yeah. Because otherwise you're getting bad
and maybe
press.
it's not leak. Maybe it's you accidentally sent something to the wrong person.
Yeah.
There's a great phrase I learned: assume positive intent.
Yes.
I would say if I could share anything, that's probably the best way to move forward in a bad situation. Just assume positive intent, that they didn't intend to be damaging. They didn't intend to be malicious. And then find out. Say, help me understand why you did that, why that happened.
It's actually very interesting, because in another episode of this podcast, I've talked to a friend at Facebook, and he told me the exact same thing. Start with the assumption of positive intent, because it leads to more constructive conversations.
Yes,
exactly. Yes, and conversation, and not yes, but. And then you look for issues why it won't work.
And that's the closed mindset instead of the growth mindset. And that, just for people, if they want to understand more about the closed mindset versus the open mindset, there's a TED Talk with a professor, Carol Dweck.
Perfect.
And she talks about also not yet, right? Like the idea of you're not failing, you're just not yet there. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Rewiring yourself to have a positive mindset, I would say too. And that's been a lot of work for me personally.
Yep.
Because I come from a family, from a culture, whatever, where maybe it's not always assumed positive intent. That it's, what happened? How are we going to get out of it, right?
It's like an evolutionary reaction. When something goes wrong, it's the...
fight or flight.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And so that's your natural inclination. So what can you do to rewire yourself? And you were talking about your gratitude journal, which I love. And that's something I started to do, is even on the hardest day, can you think of 3 things that were awesome that happened that day? Yeah. Even if it's someone held the door open for you, or you ate something that tasted really great. Yeah,
there's always something you can be very positive about.
Even if it's the worst circumstances, if someone said a kind word, you have to find 3 things. Or maybe traffic was a little better that day.
Yeah.
In LA, where it's always bad. Maybe that day it was 5 minutes less. Right? Yeah. So the half full versus the half empty glass, right?
Yeah. So it's I'm loving this conversation, and slowly, I would say we're going to come to an end.
Yes.
You've already spent a lot of time with me, which is great. I love it. So I would like to kind of enter the last chapter, during the whole conversation, you already gave many tips of what kind of TED Talks people can watch or books they can read if they want to learn more. And I guess many people do want to learn more because what you've said has been very exciting, and I think got the attention of many people. So that's what the last chapter of this conversation is about. If they are interested in the whole storytelling thing, communication, how can they get into it, get started with it, or however? So it's about learning. And something that I always like to, a way how I like to think about things is the 80-20 rule. So Pareto efficiency and stuff like that. And what it basically means is, how do you get to 80% of your results or goals by 20% of the effort? Yeah. Because the idea is the last 20% will take up 80% of your efforts to achieve. And
yes, the 80-20 rule.
Yeah. So let me rephrase it for your situation. If you were a beginner and you would like to reach 80% of a professional's level with only 20% of the time a pro has, we might think of a scenario where the two of us have 1 week together, can spend maybe 2 hours every evening. So not enough time to get it done. But what would you focus on telling me, teaching me, or what I should think about, what I should read, or just how would you approach that?
So I'd say two things. One, I'd say go inward first. Think about your stories. Think about the framework I was talking about. What's your origin story? What are your signature stories, crisis stories, and your future story? And think of yourself as the startup, right? And how are you going to pitch yourself? Because in many cases, that's how the power of persuasion works, is through the power of your personality or your stories or your knowledge, you're going to get someone to get on board with you. So I'd say go inward first. And then conversely, I'd say be the data point is the phrase I like to say. So yes, the TED Talks, yes, the business books, yes, the classes. But for me, and we were talking about this before this podcast, serendipity.
Yeah.
The journey. And the journey with a loose plan, but not an exacting plan. So definitely taking a trip, you're going to go to San Francisco. Maybe you looked into a place to stay. Maybe you've decided you want to see the redwood trees, the Golden Gate Bridge. I would say leave yourself time for serendipity. Get lost, literally. Not get lost like get out of here, but get lost. Take a wrong turn because you're going to need other people to help you to get where you need to go. Or maybe they invite you in and now you have a new friend and you're getting a new story. And there's something about traveling by yourself, even if it's you have to go to a meeting and you get lost and you get out and ask someone for directions, there's an opportunity there to learn something and really get to know someone. So I have so many great stories like that of how I got lost traveling and how someone helped me and I got a friend out of it. So
it forces you to be in an open mindset.
And vulnerable. And that's something else I haven't talked about. As a leader, one of the best things you could do is tell a crisis story that you had in your life. Because the minute you show vulnerability, someone can relate to you. So I would say if you're looking for those kinds of stories, and the Valley's filled with them, read up on people who literally crashed and burned and came out of it and came back stronger. So many of these serial entrepreneurs here, their first, second, or third company was a failure. And they learned from it. So I would say learn from them, but also learn from yourself, because nothing beats an authentic story and an authentic experience. And someone taught me a really interesting technique recently, that if you're going to tell someone about your skills and your experience and what you can bring to that company or that product, if you start with, instead of a bulleted list. You start with the phrase, I remember when.
Yeah.
Think about that. So now you're going to go into a story. My favorite podcast lately is Masters of Scale.
Yes, with
Reid Hoffman,
Yeah.
the co-founder of LinkedIn. And he interviews people. And there was a great one with Sheryl Sandberg. And I just listened to one with Brian Chesky, who's the co-founder of Airbnb. And they all tell amazing stories. And there's failure, there's success, there's scaling, there's all kinds of lessons out of it. But there's often a vulnerability in the story, that they didn't know something or they were humbled by something and how they learned from it. And they, as they say in the Valley, maybe they pivoted from it, right? So I would say make sure you have your own experiences as well. So I remember helping to interview some MBA candidates once. And I was so looking forward to meeting a woman. Her resume was amazing. It was the most boring hour of my life. She didn't have her stories. So I tried to get some out of her. And that's when it was amazing, is when I asked her to explain to me a time that she experienced a certain interaction. And that's when finally it went from bullet points to a real human with real needs. And she gave a great insight as a result. But my Lord, that first 45 minutes or so, I was like, ooh.
That's I would say that's a sign of being insecure when you try to stick with like the common path.
Yes.
And as soon as you reveal personal stories, we're back to this vulnerability aspect again.
And I would say if you worry too much about being part of the tribe,
it's not going to work.
And you're worried about fitting in too much. When I was building a team and hiring people, I had a VP at the time who's very funny, and he said, think about when you're interviewing people, say to yourself, if I'm on a long layover at an airport and I've got about 4 or 5 hours with this person, am I going to want to be with them?
That's good. That's
right?
Good.
So think about that. Think about unbelievably qualified, great. As far as experiences and skills, at the end of the day, there's a EQ. Have you heard about EQ? Emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
What is it that you bring? And I had a young designer ask for advice recently. And he said, what advice would you give a young designer? And I said, be interesting. And your experiences should not be borrowed. That's not you seeing a video or reading a story on YouTube. That's you having the experience and then sharing it. So digital is amazing, and I love all my products. I love all my social media platforms. It helps me keep up with the world. I need to go out and create some experiences as well. So, absolutely.
And this was kind of a to-do list, or just things that you recommend to do. And I'm a great fan of Tim Ferriss, who does an amazing podcast. And he also has this idea of let's think of a not to-do list. What are the things that you definitely should not do? And you have so many years of experience looking back. What are the things that you believe? Those are things that I recommend people just not to do. Save time and focus on something else.
I actually would take it a little bit higher.
All right.
And I'd say make sure you have time to have boredom. Because boredom is where creativity happens.
Yeah.
So maybe leave your smartphone or your whatever your digital wearable is of the day, your whatever screen it is that you're used to having, forget it, intentionally or accidentally, and just maybe wander down a road and be a little bored and your mind wanders. I would argue that's where the best ideas happen. So now my husband and I were talking about, what's that only time left anymore? It's in the shower.
Yeah.
And how many times someone had a great idea in the shower? I know I worked for someone where we were like, oh, he was in the shower again. Here we go. He had such great ideas. And he would say, I thought of this in the shower. So how many more shower moments can you have?
Yeah.
And one of my things I regret maybe is I thought I was so smart by moving very close to work. And I realized I didn't have any boredom time. The time I enjoyed being on the train getting to work, looking out the window and just thinking and seeing things like a beautiful tree. I had engineered it in such a way that I didn't have any boredom.
Any downtime.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And no time to decompress coming home either. So my favorite thing to do lately is take a train instead of driving.
Yeah.
And my husband will do business down in Southern California. And for no reason at all, I will take the train to meet him. And I love it. I've come up with every great product the world should have, driving down or taking the train down, or just wandering in my mind, taking a journey, you know, looking out the window and having the most amazing discussions with people. I met a lovely young gentleman who had the most difficult childhood, went to the military, and then graduated and had his, I think they still call it the GI Bill, but where you get money to go to school. And he had fallen in love with the culinary arts because growing up, he was always hungry and food was just a thing to have. And then when he traveled the world, he realized food was this amazing thing. And he was so obsessed with food. He was buying every cookbook and learning about every chef. And he was an apprentice here with a very successful restaurant and learning. And he couldn't wait to be a chef one day. And we talked for probably 2 hours. And I was so inspired by him. And he was getting off the train and he was still a reserve. So he had to go back on the base. And I thought, wow. I would have never met him if I was driving. Yeah. And I would say that's, for me, the favorite is having a bank of stories, not only of your own, but others. Think of...
it's a library.
It's a library, yeah. So if you think about the State of the Union address in the United States and how Obama would tell his stories, or even previous presidents, they would give the example of a citizen and what that citizen in the world did and how they were inspired by them or how they want to help them do better, right? Instead of just data points about, we will increase the budget by, and these many people will benefit because of, if you bring it, the best companies have a huge number and then contextualize it with a data point for one person.
Yeah, make it relatable.
Exactly.
I think we've come full circle. We started with a story of you going on a journey to the Czech Republic, and I guess what you would like to leave the audience with is go on a journey, get lost, wander around. Beginner's mind.
Yes. Always learn.
Always learn.
And try. Don't worry about failing. Just try. And the last thing I'll say is there's a great banner, a series of great banners they have at the Stanford D School, and one is the only way to do it is to do it. Yeah.
And with that, I would say, let's do it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jen, for your time. I very much appreciated it. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
This is it, dear listeners. You've reached the end of this inspiring conversation with Jennifer Greenwood. To catch all the books and videos mentioned in this episode, please visit my blog where you'll find it all. It's sparkr.ch/blog. Once again, sparkr.ch/blog. Besides links to this episode's content, you also find other episodes of the Sparkr Podcast where I'll talk to outstanding people and organizations and dig deep to unveil their insights, mindsets, and factors of success. For example, you can learn why Facebook's culture is its ultimate performance hack, according to Timo, who I could interview right at Facebook's headquarters in Menlo Park. Or in one of the upcoming episodes, I'll talk to a super successful business angel who's invested in multiple unicorns. His track record is simply astonishing and amazing. With him, I'll talk about his approach to risk, how his investing process works, or what major shifts he sees coming up in the future. So make sure to subscribe to the Sparkr Podcast in iTunes so you won't miss this next episode coming out soon. With all that said, be a beginner again, enrich people's lives with great stories and inspire the world around you. Have an amazing day, and we'll see each other again when the next episode of the Sparkr Podcast arrives.